This woman is the most controversial climber in the history of Mount Everest, and her name is Sandy Hill Pittman. A California girl turned New York socialite, in 1996, Sandy hoped to become the 34th woman ever to reach the summit of Mount Everest. She had failed to reach the summit not once, but twice before in her life, and this time, she was gonna do anything to make it to the top. Well, spoiler, Sandy did become the 34th woman to summit Everest. Sure, she made history, but that's not what would ultimately define her story. Folks, this is the story of a disaster, mishaps, bad decisions, human error, leaving people to die. When Sandy descended from the mountain, nobody cared that she had reached the summit. Instead, she found herself caught in the middle of a media firestorm, one that she herself had a hand in creating. Sandy Hill Pittman was made out to be the ultimate Everest villain. But that begs the question, did she deserve it? I'm going to tell you the story of Sandy Hill Pittman and leave it up to you to decide whether she's a villain, a victim, or maybe even a hero. This is going to be a bit of a controversial one. To be honest, I'm a little bit stressed out about it because I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I'm going to do my best. And so, anyways, when all is said and done, I think that you're going to see what I have to say about it is pretty fair. That's my intention anyway. And so buckle up, folks. And make sure you hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying my videos. 1 million subscribers is our goal, and we've got a long ways to go. And so any help is much appreciated. Just click the subscribe button. Okay, let's travel back in time to the year 1996, which is the year I was born, coincidentally. And we're not going to start our story on Mount Everest, which might sound weird, but rather we're going to start in a New York City nightclub called Nell's. Nell's was known to be this hot spot in New York for celebrities in the mid-90s. And on one particular night, there was this giant farewell party happening. And there were big names in attendance, by the way, like Calvin Klein and Bianca Jagger. All of these people were there to celebrate a soon-to-be climber of Mount Everest, who of course was Sandy Pittman. She was their friend, and she was also the wife of MTV co-founder Robert Pittman. It was pretty easy to pick Sandy out in the crowd. I mean, for one thing, she was 5'10", but more notably, she came to her own farewell party dressed fully in her climbing gear. Remember, this is a nightclub in New York City, right? People are all dressed up. But no, she was wearing crampons and a snowsuit. She even brought her ice axe into this club. Let's just say that Sandy obviously knew how to attract attention and how to wow the camera. And hearing all that stuff, I mean, it's pretty easy to kind of roll your eyes at it, right? But the truth is that Sandy was not naive, and she actually had quite the climbing resume leading up to this 1996 Everest attempt. She had started climbing at only 13 years old, and over the years, she had reached the point of being one summit away from being only the second American woman in history to complete what is called the 7 summits, which is summiting the highest mountain on every single continent. It's obviously a very impressive feat, and Sandy was kind of, we'll say, obsessed with knocking out this last summit. I mean, it was consuming her, right? It was even affecting her personal life. The only problem was that the last summit, Mount Everest, was the hardest of all of them. And remember, this was not her first attempt. She had tried twice before. She was 0 for 2, and she was determined to change that. Folks, her third time had to be the charm. And she did have a few things going for her this time around. By the year 1996, commercial expeditions up Everest were exploding because, the path up the mountain had become more accessible to a wider range of climbers. There was tons of guide services, Sherpas. It still cost over $120,000 in today's money to climb Everest, but that was obviously not an issue for Sandy. Sandy also chose to climb with Scott Fisher, who was this legendary guide known for his aggressive style, we'll call it, and his priority to get as many of his clients to the summit as possible. And this third time, Sandy would even give herself one more boost of urgency to fuel her fire. She would end up striking a deal with NBC to transmit messages to the internet so that she could basically live blog from the mountain. I don't know all the history of this, but from my understanding, this was a pretty unique thing. But it also meant that she had to haul a 20-pound satellite phone up the mountain. But her and her guide, Scott, well, they thought it would be worth it. I mean, it would be really good for future business for Scott, and it would just be amazing and inspirational to show the world what it was like to summit the highest mountain. So there was a lot of pressure and literal weight on Sandy now as she and her expedition team began their ascent. Oh, and speaking of weight, I don't know if this is true, but legend also has it that Sandy chose to bring an espresso machine with her up the mountain. And look, I mean, I know a few outdoorsy folks who go to pretty extreme lengths for their coffee, but bringing a full espresso machine up Everest is probably a little bit overkill if it's true. I don't know. At the very least, it's kind of funny, right? And the truth is, that's probably the last funny thing that's going to be told in the rest of this story, because we're about to get to some very tragic and disturbing events. And so before we do that, I do want to just pause for a second and lighten the mood and tell you about Drink Element. Now, if you've never watched one of my many Element ads before, I totally get it, no hard feelings, but please don't skip this one. Because folks, it's now solidly summer. It's getting really, really hot out there, and I know a lot of you, I'm talking to you, you're gonna be sweating no matter what you're doing, whether it's hiking or exercise or just yard work. You need to replace your electrolytes after you get all sweaty with Drink Element. Element has no sugar. All it has is an amazing taste and the electrolytes that you need to stay safe, healthy, and hydrated when you're sweating. Oh, and I got a deal for you, by the way. Go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. And when you do that, you're gonna get a free 8-count sample pack of Element's most popular drink mix flavors with any purchase that you make on their website, which is an amazing deal, and it's really gonna help you understand exactly what Element is all about. So one more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click that link. Do it right now. Appreciate you, Element. All right, let's get back into it. On May 10th, 1996, guide Scott Fisher's group, which of course included Sandy, woke up at Camp 4 on Mount Everest, ready to make that final push up to the summit. So far, things had been relatively usual, but there had been a few issues on the way up the mountain. Some of the preset ropes had become unfixed, which caused delays. Oh, and in the middle of the trek, Scott actually had to take a client all the way back down the mountain and then go all the way back up in order to meet the rest of his party. Oh, and that 20-pound satellite phone that I told you about earlier that the Sherpas lugged all the way up the mountain, well, that was no longer working at the altitude. But regardless of all of those things going wrong, everyone was excited this morning, yeah, especially Sandy, right? Because her dream of finishing the 7 summits and, of course, summiting Mount Everest was literally one final push away. In total, over 30 climbers would attempt to summit Everest on May 10th, 1996, across 3 different climbing groups. And what you have to understand is that they all had a very tight window to do this before a predicted storm and bad weather conditions would potentially start up right around 2 p.m. And tragically, as soon as they began their ascent on this day, panic pretty much immediately set in. At a few vital points along the final climb up, like the Hillary Step, for instance, have you heard of it? Fixed ropes had not been set yet again. This caused even more delays as Sherpas rushed, to get the ropes ready. Some climbers even turned back at this point because they were stressed about missing their turnaround time, but not Sandy Pittman. And also, crucially, not the guides themselves, who pushed on with a lot of their clients. And you have to remember, the eyes of the world were on this climb. The guides all felt this tremendous pressure. I mean, you can kind of understand this, right? This pressure to deliver these really high-paying, even high-profile clients like Sandy to the summit. But around this point, Sandy was starting to struggle. She had never even made it past Camp 4 in either of her first 2 attempts, and now she was literally right below the summit of Everest. And despite struggling, there was no way that she was going to turn back now, right? She was being incredibly stubborn, maybe even a little bit reckless, but you can also kind of understand, she came all this way, this is her dream, she's literally almost there, right? Her stubbornness ultimately meant that a Sherpa would need to short rope the exhausted Sandy up the mountain, which basically means that a Sherpa tethered themselves to Sandy and kind of supported her as she climbed. To go from dragging her heavy satellite phone up the mountain now to this probably wasn't very fun for that particular Sherpa. Eventually, the turnaround time, the time that they were supposed to quit and head back down the mountain because it was getting too late, well, that time eventually passed, but most of the climbers were still on their way up at this point, not going down. And then, finally, at 2:30 p.m., Sandy and a few others reached the summit of Mount Everest. Sandy started high-fiving everyone and cheering, but what she didn't understand was that this was not the time to celebrate. And just as Sandy and the rest of the climbers looked down the mountain at the path leading all the way back down to Camp 4, Mother Nature decided to unleash on them. And by that I mean, well, pretty much worst case scenario happened. A nasty blizzard started up. Snow and wind are whipping in everyone's faces, making them more and more tired one by one. Scott Fisher, the legendary Everest guide, was now experiencing the symptoms of severe altitude sickness, and it got so bad for him that he literally couldn't go on any further. And this was also the case for a few other climbers. The guides are panicking, they're kind of scrambling to figure out their roles, who's in charge, and just scrambling to get back down the mountain. Sandy herself was also panicking at this time. She was stumbling and falling. She was tangling herself in her ropes, holding her ice axe in the wrong hand. Things got so bad for Sandy that she needed to ask for a literal shot of adrenaline in order to help keep her going. And folks, things did not get better. The blizzard got even worse, and at the same time, so did Sandy's condition, even after taking this adrenaline shot. One guide who was named Neil Beitelman would even clip himself to Sandy, and he tried to slide down the fixed ropes with her attached to him, but this didn't really work. A couple other climbers tried the same thing. And I haven't even mentioned yet, it was now completely dark outside. It was pitch black, and with over 50 mile per hour gusts of wind, 50 miles per hour, they couldn't even tell which way was up or which way was down. And this left them with no choice but to just sit there and try to wait out the storm. A smaller group of climbers, including Sandy and Neil, kind of huddled together in the pitch black. It's well below freezing. They're up at extreme altitude, and they're even out of their oxygen reserves at this point. I mean, they were basically in this big dog pile, kind of just beating each other and screaming in each other's ears to try to keep themselves from falling asleep. Because we all know, if someone fell asleep, they weren't ever gonna wake up again. When the blizzard finally stopped around midnight, a few of these climbers were able to make their way from this dog pile back down to Camp 4, but this did not include Sandy Pittman. Herself and a couple of others were just too weak to go on, and so they just kind of accepted that they were just gonna lay there and die, essentially. And they laid there for over 3 hours without any help. I can't even imagine this, dude. This is why I'll never climb Everest. I'm also not tough enough or skilled enough, but regardless, can you imagine this? You're just laying there waiting to die, kind of rubbing each other to try to keep warm, but it's not working. I mean, just as Sandy was pretty much ready to give up, a guide who had rushed back to Camp 4 earlier, this guide was named Anatoly Bokriev, well, he would actually stumble upon Sandy. After giving her some oxygen and attempting to kind of coax her up to her feet so that she could walk down the mountain under her own power, Anatoly would eventually just resort to carrying, or more realistically, dragging Sandy all the way back down to Camp 4. And by the way, he had done this with some other climbers as well, but Sandy would be his final rescue that night. At this point, he had just run out of energy to search for anyone else, and carrying Sandy down the mountain, or dragging her, basically took whatever energy that he had left out of him. The next morning, numbers started to come in. And of course, I'm talking about a death toll here. In total, 8 people died during this disaster on various parts of the mountain between Camp 4 and all the way up to the summit. In fact, one climber died only 5 yards away from where Anatoly Bokriev had rescued Sandy. But ultimately, yeah, she was rescued. And though she had been one of the lucky survivors, the storm did not end for Sandy when she left Mount Everest. In fact, it was pretty much only the beginning. This is where things get really controversial, folks. And it started with this post-summit interview that Sandy did with NBC from the base camp of Mount Everest, where she referred to the trek as the NBC Everest Assault Expedition. And this rubbed some people the wrong way, to put it mildly. I mean, Sandy, after all, was the one who had invited NBC to be a part of this expedition, not Scott Fisher, their leader and guide, who unfortunately passed away on the mountain. I mean, there was other people involved. It wasn't like this entire expedition just revolved around Sandy and NBC, and so you can kind of understand why people were upset about that. And when Sandy returned to New York, things didn't really get any better. She could not stay out of the public eye. This was a massive story. She kind of tried to stay relatively quiet at first and kind of handle damage control from the media as best she could, and mourn the loss of Scott Fisher and the others who had died. But it didn't take long before the press began to tell their story of her climb, if that makes sense. There's a pretty infamous article in Vanity Fair, which was written only 3 months after this disaster, which is a perfect example of what I'm talking about here. This article ripped into Sandy. Frankly, while the article is definitely a little biased at times, it was just about the worst possible look for Sandy. I mean, you can even go read it yourself, but basically there are a few moments in the aftermath of all this where Sandy really did not do herself any favors. First of all, she failed to recognize the two men who had saved her life, Neil and Anatoly, while she was at this cocktail party that she was throwing to honor Scott Fisher, and that didn't sit well with a lot of people. And then she also publicly commented that the guides that were there were not heroes that night, but instead were just, being paid to do their jobs, which is true, but you could probably see why that didn't really come across very well. One of the climbers from that 1996 expedition, who is named John Krakauer, would go on to publish a book in the following year called Into Thin Air. Again, I'm sure a lot of you have read this book, or at the very least heard of it. This book did not really help Sandy's reputation either. Basically, John introduced a brand new debate, which essentially was, what are you doing on this mountain if you can't actually get yourself down without relying on other people? Now, to be fair, that's not exactly what it says. These are my words, but this, of course, did point right at Sandy and kind of insinuated that the extra help that she needed may have contributed to some of the chaos on the mountain that day. The combination of that very famous book and this Vanity Fair article painted Sandy as this wealthy, out-of-touch American woman whose lack of preparedness for Everest and all the luxury items that she brought with her were at least partially responsible, or at least reasons for why so many climbers died that night. However, it is worth mentioning that it wasn't all bad for Sandy. She did have some supporters that came to her side. Several experienced climbers actually went on to defend her and pointed to all of the other issues that happened during the climb, and also the decisions made by the guides that kind of put them in this dangerous spot. Anatoly Bokriev, once again, the guide who saved Sandy's life that night, well, he said that Sandy showed grit in her survival effort. And yet, despite some of her defenders, it really wasn't enough to stop this onslaught of hatred and judgment that was slung at Sandy. And to this day, there are still people arguing about whether Sandy should have been climbing Mount Everest in the first place. Now, I'm going to give my opinion on this a little bit, and frankly, it doesn't really mean much because I'm not an Everest climber. I wasn't there, and so don't read into this too much, but since I'm telling this story, I don't really think that it's fair to just blame Sandy for everything, certainly, and I kind of think her role in the overall disaster was just not as significant as some people have said. Claims of her being an inexperienced, naive climber are just not really true. Again, she hadn't done Everest before, but she did have a lot of experience, and I also think it's really important to note that for better or for worse, that's a whole nother debate, Sandy was allowed to do what she did at the time. I mean, she was encouraged to pay her way to the summit up Everest, just like lots of other people. Hell, Scott Fisher, her guide, even approved of Sandy's added gear, that's the satellite phone and stuff, in order to promote his expedition with NBC. To me, the guides who pushed past the turnaround time, all of the unfixed ropes causing delays, and the chaotic game plan during the blizzard, all those factors contributed far more to the disaster than any one person could have, let alone Sandy. But of course, that's not to say that Sandy's climb wasn't problematic either. Truthfully, she probably wasn't ready to summit Everest that day. She probably did make a lot of big mistakes. But she also wasn't the only person who wasn't ready to summit Everest that day. She wasn't the only person to make mistakes, and she wasn't even the first person to be short roped by a Sherpa. Oh, and she also wasn't the first person to need a shot of adrenaline that day either in order to stay conscious and not die. However, she may have been the first person to bring an espresso machine up with her, allegedly, but Who knows? At the end of the day, Sandy Hill Pittman wanted to shed a positive light on Mount Everest. She did make for a very easy scapegoat for this disaster, and of course, her handling of the immediate aftermath with the media and stuff was definitely not very good in hindsight. But at the same time, you never know how traumatized people are by these kinds of disasters. I mean, I would probably want to block out nearly freezing to death on Everest and being dragged down the mountain as well. To me, and again, I don't really know, but it just seems like she had good intentions at the very least. I mean, her live blog was going out to kids and inspiring them to chase their dreams, which is honorable. And I'm sure that her climb did inspire some of them, but much more than that, it proved to be the best possible warning for future generations of climbers to not take Mount Everest lightly like this ever again. But again, that's just me. Take my opinion with a grain of salt, a massive grain of salt here. Oh, and speaking of opinions, I'm really curious what you guys think. I always appreciate your comments, and so let me know, am I going too easy on Sandy here? Is there something that I left out? Definitely a possibility. I want to hear all your thoughts. You guys always have the most insightful things to say. You just make it respectful, please, because honestly, this is a story that people have been arguing over for years and will continue to argue over for years to come, even though it's been almost 30 years since this happened. If you want even more details, not about Sandy, but just about the infamous 1996 Everest disaster generally, I've got a link in the description to a previous video where I covered it. YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, and so folks, give it a click, do it right now, and I will see all of you in the next video. You guys are the best subscribers. I'm so lucky. Thank you guys very, very much.